Who really was Abraham Lincoln? Beyond the marble monuments and the familiar image of the bearded president lies a complex, flawed, and deeply human story, one of poverty, ambition, heartbreak, and courage. In this documentary, we'll uncover the untold sides of Lincoln's life, the doubts that haunted him, the political enemies who tried to destroy him, the tragedies that shaped his empathy, and the personal contradictions that made him one of history's most fascinating figures. So, if you love history and want to understand the real man behind the legend, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and let us begin the story of Abraham Lincoln, as you've never heard it before. Abraham Lincoln was born on February 12, 1809, in a small log cabin near Hodgenville, Kentucky. The scene of his birth has become almost mythical, the humble frontier, a single-room dwelling, and a family with little more than the bare necessities. But behind the romanticized image lies a story of survival and struggle. His father, Thomas Lincoln, was a hard-working but modest farmer, often frustrated by poor soil and insecure land titles. His mother, Nancy Hanks Lincoln, possessed a quiet intelligence and a tenderness that deeply marked young Abraham. They were people of the frontier, resilient, devout, and perpetually chasing a better life just beyond the horizon. Life in Kentucky was harsh, and by the time Abraham was 7, the family had already been forced to move north into Indiana. The reason was typical of the time: disputes over land ownership and the constant uncertainty that plagued poor settlers. Their new home was scarcely better: dense forests, cold winters, and endless manual labor. The young boy learned early what it meant to work from sunrise to sunset, clearing fields and building fences. The tools of his childhood were not toys, but axes and plows. Lincoln's mother died when he was just 9 years old. Nancy's passing left a wound that never fully healed. She fell victim to milk sickness, a mysterious illness caused by drinking the milk of cows that had eaten toxic plants. Abraham watched helplessly as his mother's health declined, an experience that imprinted on him a lifelong awareness of human frailty and loss. Her death left the family adrift until his father remarried a widow named Sarah Bush Johnston, who became a stabilizing force in his life. Sarah brought warmth and a measure of order to the household, encouraging Abraham's curiosity and thirst for learning, in a place where books were rare treasures. In the wilderness of Indiana, schools were few and far between. Lincoln received less than a year of formal education, scattered across different periods. Yet those who knew him remembered how he devoured every book he could find. The Bible, Aesop's fables, and the life of George Washington became his silent teachers. He would copy entire passages to improve his handwriting and read aloud to himself as he worked, letting the rhythm of the words sink into his memory. His mind, though isolated in the backwoods, reached far beyond the frontier. Even as a boy, Lincoln's intelligence stood out. Neighbors recalled the tall, lanky child who preferred reading to hunting, who could spin a story or recite a poem while others rested after a day's labor. His father often saw this as laziness. He wanted his son to be practical, not lost in books. But Abraham's imagination could not be confined to the plow. That tension between practicality and idealism would follow him throughout life, shaping both his strength and his struggles. In the evenings, the family gathered around the fireplace. Abraham listened as older settlers told stories of the Revolution, of Washington and Jefferson, of the nation's founding ideals. Though he could not yet grasp their full meaning, these tales planted the first seeds of his political imagination. In the flickering light of that cabin, the boy who had almost nothing began to dream of a larger world, one where ideas mattered as much as muscle. By his teens, Lincoln had grown tall and strong, earning respect for his physical labor. He could split rails, chop wood, and guide a plow with endurance that impressed older men. But behind his strength was a growing sense of restlessness. He began to question the limits of his world, the rules that kept families like his trapped in cycles of poverty. There was a hunger in him, not for wealth but for purpose. When he wasn't working, he borrowed books from anyone who owned them. He read about law, history, and moral philosophy. Words became his escape, his way of making sense of the contradictions of frontier life, a life where men preached liberty while living in a nation that still tolerated slavery. These contradictions did not yet define him, but they stirred something deep within him, a moral unease, a sense that the world could and should be better. Though his family lived in isolation, Lincoln observed people closely. He noticed how pride, ignorance, and greed could divide even the smallest communities. He saw how compassion and honesty could mend them. Over time, he began to mimic the storytelling style of preachers and traveling speakers, learning how rhythm and tone could move an audience. This early fascination with language would later become one of his greatest gifts, the power to use words not just to persuade, but to heal. By the time the Lincolns moved once again, this time to Illinois, Abraham was approaching adulthood. The boy from the log cabin had grown into a young man of immense curiosity and quiet strength. He had known hunger, loss, and endless toil, but he had also discovered within himself an unshakable resolve. The lessons of his youth, endurance, empathy, humility, were not learned in classrooms or books, but in the raw, often unforgiving reality of frontier life. These years would form the foundation of the man he would become. They gave him the moral backbone to stand firm when others wavered, and the empathy to understand both the greatness and the weakness of human nature. In the silence of those Indiana woods, long before the crowds and the speeches, Abraham Lincoln began to shape the mind and heart that would one day change the course of a nation. As Abraham Lincoln entered his late teens, the wilderness that had shaped him also began to confine him. The endless rhythm of chopping wood, plowing fields, and hauling supplies left little space for the growing intellect within him. Though his hands were rough from labor, his mind reached for something greater, for understanding, for meaning. In an era when opportunity was reserved for the privileged few, Lincoln's only inheritance was his determination to rise beyond the narrow boundaries of his birth. When the Lincoln family moved to Illinois in 1830, Abraham was 21. It was the last migration of his youth, one final frontier. The journey westward was grueling, a test of endurance through cold and mud, but to Lincoln it symbolized a quiet declaration of independence. Once settled, he began to work for himself, taking odd jobs, splitting rails, ferrying goods down the Mississippi River, and even serving as a store clerk. Each experience broadened his view of the world. Traveling along the river, he witnessed slavery firsthand for the first time, seeing men and women chained and sold. The image would remain etched in his mind, though he spoke little of it then. It was a silent awakening, one that would later echo through his words and actions. In New Salem, a small but lively frontier village, Lincoln found a place that seemed to match his restless spirit. The town was a mix of farmers, merchants, and travelers, all striving to carve their futures out of the wilderness. Here, Lincoln's natural charm and sharp wit began to draw attention. Though he arrived with little more than his clothes and a few books, he quickly became known for his honesty, fairness, and curious intellect. People began to trust him, not because of his status or wealth, but because of his integrity. He worked as a store clerk at Denton Offutt's general store, where he had time to read between customers. He studied everything he could find: Shakespeare, the law, grammar, and mathematics. By night he read by candlelight, sometimes lying on the floor with a borrowed book in his hands, determined to master its contents. Those who knew him would later recall the tall, awkward young man with eyes full of quiet intensity, always lost in thought, always asking questions. Education for Lincoln was an act of defiance. He refused to accept that ignorance was the destiny of the poor. He taught himself logic, studied the power of words, and began to imitate great speeches to understand what made them persuasive. His hunger for learning was relentless, and it wasn't just about knowledge, it was about control. In a world where fate seemed governed by birth and circumstance, learning gave him power over himself. In New Salem, he also discovered something else: the art of connection. He joined local debates, listened to preachers and politicians, and started to shape his own views on the issues of the day. He learned to argue without anger, to persuade without arrogance. His humor disarmed people, his fairness won them over. It was during this period that the nickname Honest Abe began to take root. In a community where trust was currency, Lincoln's word became as good as gold. But life in New Salem was not without hardship. His first real heartbreak came when he met Anne Rutledge, a young woman admired for her kindness and intelligence. The two formed a deep bond, one built more on understanding than romance. When Anne died suddenly of illness, Lincoln was devastated. Friends feared for his sanity, describing him as lost in grief and melancholy. The experience left him changed, quieter, more introspective, and perhaps more compassionate toward the pain of others. Through his grief, he found purpose. Lincoln began to focus even more intensely on his self-education. He took up law books borrowed from a local attorney and studied them methodically, line by line. There were no professors, no classrooms, just long nights of silent concentration. He memorized statutes, dissected arguments, and trained his mind to think logically and precisely. He once said, "I studied with nobody. The most useful way for me to learn was to read and think and compare and decide for myself." That method would become his signature, disciplined, independent, and deeply analytical. His growing intellect and reputation soon caught the attention of his neighbors, who encouraged him to run for local office. Though he lost his first campaign for the Illinois General Assembly, it revealed something crucial. Lincoln had a gift for connecting with ordinary people. He spoke in plain language with sincerity and humor, and his speeches reflected a rare combination of humility and conviction. He wasn't a polished politician yet, but he had the one quality that no training could teach: authenticity. After his initial defeat, Lincoln didn't give up. He joined the local militia during the Black Hawk War, where he was elected captain by his peers, a small but meaningful recognition of his leadership. Though he saw no combat, the experience gave him a sense of discipline and confidence that would serve him later. When he returned, he worked as a surveyor and postmaster, continuing to read law in his spare time. Each role added another layer to his understanding of people and responsibility. By his late 20s, Lincoln had passed the bar and was ready to begin his career as a lawyer. From the boy who once borrowed books by the firelight to the self-taught man ready to enter public life, the transformation was extraordinary. New Salem had been more than a place. It was his crucible. It was here that he learned to balance intellect with empathy, ambition with honesty. Lincoln's journey from the farm to the frontier village was not a straight path, but one carved through resilience, heartbreak, and an insatiable desire to grow. He had no wealth, no pedigree, and no formal education, yet he possessed something far rarer: the courage to believe that knowledge and character could lift him beyond circumstance. And in the quiet heart of New Salem, the foundation of one of America's greatest leaders was laid, not by chance, but by the deliberate will of a man determined to become more than the sum of his origins. When Abraham Lincoln stepped into the world of politics, he did so as an outsider in every possible sense. He had no family connections, no formal education, and no wealth to fund a campaign. What he did have was a remarkable reputation for honesty, a sharp intellect, and an instinct for connecting with ordinary people. In the rough-and-tumble world of 1830s Illinois politics, that was enough to get him noticed, but not enough to guarantee success. His first attempt at political office came in 1832, when he ran for a seat in the Illinois General Assembly. The election took place in Sangamon County, a sprawling rural district where local reputation mattered more than party loyalty. Lincoln was just 23, barely known outside New Salem, and had no real experience. Yet his campaign was driven by a simple desire to improve the community that had given him a chance. In his brief campaign address, he promised better roads, improved infrastructure, and fairness in public policy. His platform was modest, but his sincerity was unmistakable. The campaign, however, was cut short by the outbreak of the Black Hawk War, a brief but intense conflict between settlers and Native Americans in the Illinois Territory. Lincoln volunteered and was elected captain of his militia company, an early sign of the respect he commanded among his peers. Though he never saw battle, his service gave him confidence and earned him a modest sense of local pride. When the war ended, he returned home to resume his campaign, but the election had moved on without him. He lost, finishing 8th out of 13 candidates. For most men, that defeat would have been discouraging, but Lincoln saw it as a beginning. "I was beaten," he later said, "but I was not discouraged." That resilience would define him throughout life. He returned to New Salem broke but unbowed, determined to rebuild. He worked as a storekeeper, a postmaster, and a surveyor, whatever would pay the bills. He was not yet a politician or a lawyer, but he was something more valuable: a man trusted by his neighbors. As the 1830s progressed, Lincoln's ambitions began to sharpen. He had come to believe that law and politics were powerful tools for progress, capable of lifting people out of ignorance and inequality. His evenings were now spent immersed in law books, preparing for the Illinois bar examination. In 1834, his persistence paid off. He was elected to the state legislature as a member of the Whig Party. It was his first real victory, and it marked the start of a political career that would grow with each passing year. The Illinois legislature in those days was a frontier institution, filled with colorful characters, heated debates, and frequent compromise. Lincoln quickly proved himself to be thoughtful, pragmatic, and remarkably adept at persuasion. He avoided personal attacks, listened carefully to opponents, and built relationships across party lines. Though still young and inexperienced, he demonstrated a rare political skill, the ability to disagree without hatred. It was a quality that would later define his presidency. But his early years in Springfield were not only about politics. It was there that Lincoln faced the emotional struggles that would shadow his life. His relationship with Mary Todd, a well-educated woman from a prominent Kentucky family, was as passionate as it was turbulent. Mary admired Lincoln's intellect and ambition, but his melancholy and self-doubt often drove a wedge between them. Before their eventual marriage, he endured a painful period of indecision and depression, known among friends as his hypo, a deep sadness that seemed to overwhelm him. Those who knew him best said he could fall into silence for hours, lost in his thoughts, his face clouded by invisible weight. Professionally, however, Lincoln continued to rise. After passing the bar, he moved permanently to Springfield and began practicing law. His firm handled everything from property disputes to criminal defense, often traveling hundreds of miles along the 8th Judicial Circuit, a grueling schedule that took him through farms, small towns, and muddy roads. These journeys exposed him to the realities of everyday Americans: the poor farmer struggling with debt, the widow fighting for her rights, the immigrant building a new life. Their stories deepened his empathy and grounded his politics in human experience. As a lawyer, Lincoln developed a distinctive style, calm, logical, and deeply moral. He preferred clarity over theatrics, reasoning over rhetoric. He once told a fellow lawyer, "Resolve to be honest at all events, and if in your own judgment you cannot be an honest lawyer, resolve to be honest without being a lawyer." His peers admired his integrity, even those who disagreed with him. Clients trusted him because they sensed he cared more about justice than victory. Meanwhile, his political identity continued to evolve. The Whig Party, led nationally by figures like Henry Clay, emphasized economic development, education, and infrastructure, values that aligned with Lincoln's own belief in opportunity through hard work. But Lincoln's politics were not purely economic. He believed deeply in moral responsibility, in the idea that society should offer every person the chance to rise. It was this belief that would one day set him on a collision course with the institution of slavery. Through the 1830s and 1840s, Lincoln's career advanced steadily. He was re-elected to the legislature multiple times, gaining influence and experience. Yet despite his growing stature, he remained humble and accessible. In taverns and courthouses, people gathered to hear him tell stories, humorous, wise, often self-deprecating tales that revealed both his intellect and humanity. Humor became his shield against despair and his bridge to others. It made him relatable in a political world often filled with arrogance and pretense. Still, the road was far from smooth. Lincoln's ambitions frequently collided with the realities of frontier politics, corruption, backroom deals, and the constant need for compromise. He struggled with the art of political maneuvering, often feeling out of place among the more calculating figures around him. His sense of moral clarity sometimes made him seem naive, but it also earned him respect. He was the kind of politician who would rather lose than lie, and in that he stood apart. By the end of the decade, Lincoln had transformed from an unpolished frontier boy into a thoughtful, articulate statesman. He had known loss and failure, love and despair, but each trial had refined him. His voice, shaped by honesty, sharpened by hardship, and elevated by conviction, was beginning to find its strength. Though the nation had yet to hear it, that voice would soon rise from the prairies of Illinois to echo through the heart of America, carrying with it a message born not of privilege, but of perseverance. Abraham Lincoln's public life was defined by reason, discipline, and composure. But beneath that calm exterior lay a man often haunted by turmoil. His journey from self-taught lawyer to statesman was intertwined with deep emotional struggles, insecurities, and an ongoing battle with melancholy that colored his relationships and ambitions alike. Nowhere was that more evident than in his bond with Mary Todd, a partnership as brilliant as it was tempestuous. Mary Todd came into Lincoln's life at a time when he was still finding his footing in Springfield's social and political world. She was from Lexington, Kentucky, educated, articulate, and from a respected Southern family. Mary was ambitious, politically astute, and fiercely opinionated. Unlike most women of her time, she followed politics closely and admired intellect above charm. When she met Lincoln at a social gathering in the early 1840s, she was immediately intrigued by his wit and sharp mind. Her cousin, Elizabeth Edwards, in whose home she was staying, introduced them. And soon their conversations stretched late into the night, debates about government, morality, and destiny. To many, they seemed an unlikely pair. Lincoln was tall, awkward, and visibly self-conscious, a man of modest background and simple manners. Mary was refined, cultured, and accustomed to a more genteel world. Yet the two shared something deeper, ambition. She saw in Lincoln not just a kind heart, but a man destined for greatness. He, in turn, was drawn to her intelligence and fire. Mary believed he would someday be President of the United States, a claim she made long before anyone else dared imagine it. Their courtship, however, was far from smooth. Lincoln's insecurities often surfaced, fueled by doubts about his worthiness, both as a suitor and as a man of standing. The shadow of his humble origins hung over him like a burden he could never fully escape. In 1841, overwhelmed by anxiety and self-doubt, Lincoln abruptly broke off their engagement without clear explanation. Friends described him during this period as deeply depressed, withdrawn, and unable to focus. He confided to one that he felt the world was all dead to him. It was one of several episodes of profound melancholy that would recur throughout his life. Yet fate, or perhaps Mary's persistence, would bring them together again. 2 years later, they reconciled and were married on November 4, 1842, in Springfield. It was a small ceremony, simple and sincere. The young couple began their life together in a modest home, far from the wealth and comfort Mary had known in her youth. Despite their differences, there was genuine affection between them, but it was often tested by Lincoln's long absences, financial worries, and the pressures of his growing political career. Marriage to Lincoln was not easy. His mind was often elsewhere, absorbed in legal cases, political debates, or his own introspective thoughts. He could be loving and gentle, but also distant, lost in contemplation. Mary, on the other hand, was passionate and sensitive, quick to feel slighted or ignored. Her fiery temperament often clashed with his quiet restraint. Yet their union endured, sustained by shared belief in his mission and by moments of warmth that reminded them both of why they had chosen each other. The couple's first years together were marked by both joy and sorrow. They had 4 sons, Robert, Edward, Willie, and Tad. Lincoln adored his children, often finding in their laughter a refuge from the weight of his thoughts. But tragedy struck early. Their second son, Edward, died in 1850, at just 3 years old, leaving both parents devastated. The loss hit Mary especially hard, and it deepened the melancholy that had always shadowed Lincoln. Yet even in grief, he drew strength from his faith, not in a strictly religious sense, but in the belief that life's suffering carried purpose. To ease another's sorrow, he once said, is to forget one's own. Lincoln's empathy, which would later define his presidency, was born in part from these personal wounds. He understood pain intimately, not as an abstract idea, but as a lived experience. His own struggles with depression gave him a quiet compassion for the suffering of others. Those who worked closely with him noticed that he never mocked weakness or dismissed sadness. He carried an awareness of human fragility that few politicians possessed. Throughout the 1850s, as Lincoln's legal and political career accelerated, his emotional burdens did not disappear. The demands of his circuit-riding law practice meant weeks away from home, long journeys through harsh weather, and countless nights in unfamiliar lodgings. Yet these solitary travels also became times of reflection. He would write poetry, read philosophy, and ponder the moral questions of the day. Observers noted that even in company, Lincoln often seemed alone, his expression distant, his thoughts inward. At home, Mary faced her own struggles. The political climate was becoming increasingly volatile, and Lincoln's growing involvement in national debates over slavery placed enormous strain on their family. Financial insecurity lingered, and Mary's social aspirations sometimes clashed with Lincoln's modest nature. Still, despite their disagreements, she remained one of his fiercest defenders, pushing him toward opportunities he might otherwise have avoided. When he hesitated to pursue higher office, it was often Mary who reminded him of his potential. Their marriage was a mirror of Lincoln's inner world, marked by contrasts between tenderness and turmoil, ambition and doubt, love and loneliness. In Mary, Lincoln found not serenity but challenge, someone who reflected both his strengths and his insecurities. Their relationship was not the calm partnership of idealized romance, but the stormy union of two powerful, complicated spirits. Through all the emotional trials, Lincoln's sense of purpose only grew stronger. The pain that once paralyzed him began to transform into empathy, into understanding. His melancholy became a kind of quiet wisdom, an awareness that greatness is not the absence of suffering, but the mastery of it. And as the political horizon darkened, as the nation itself began to fracture, that wisdom would become his greatest weapon. For Lincoln, love and loss were not separate from ambition. They were its foundation. His heart had been broken, his confidence shaken, his peace of mind tested time and again. But from those cracks emerged a deeper strength, a humility that allowed him to lead not with pride, but with compassion. In the private struggles of his own soul, Abraham Lincoln was preparing, unknowingly, for the far greater battles that lay ahead. By the mid-1850s, Abraham Lincoln had become one of Illinois' most respected lawyers and a seasoned political figure. Yet outside his home state, he remained largely unknown, another local statesman in a nation teeming with ambition. But history was shifting beneath his feet. The moral and political storm surrounding slavery was growing impossible to ignore, and it was in that crucible that Lincoln would evolve from a regional politician into a national voice of conscience. The spark came in 1854 with the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, championed by Senator Stephen A. Douglas. The law effectively overturned the Missouri Compromise, allowing new territories to decide for themselves whether to permit slavery. To many Americans, it seemed a reasonable appeal to democracy, to let the people choose. But to Lincoln, it was a betrayal of the nation's founding principles. He saw clearly that the issue was not just political, but moral. If slavery is not wrong, he would later write, nothing is wrong. The Kansas-Nebraska Act pulled Lincoln out of his semi-retirement from politics. He had stepped back after a brief, unremarkable term in Congress, content to focus on his law practice and family. But this new law stirred something in him, a conviction that the nation was drifting toward a dangerous moral compromise. He began to speak again, first in small gatherings, then in larger halls, each time refining his argument that freedom and slavery could not coexist within the same democratic system. His speeches were calm but piercing, his logic meticulous. He never shouted, he reasoned. Yet behind his quiet words was the force of moral clarity. Lincoln's message resonated deeply in Illinois and beyond. He spoke not as a radical abolitionist, but as a man grounded in fairness and law. He opposed slavery's expansion, not only because it was unjust, but because it threatened the moral soul of the Republic. He reminded his audiences that the founders had envisioned liberty as a universal right, not a privilege of birth. To Lincoln, the question was not merely political. It was a test of whether America truly believed in its own ideals. His eloquence quickly brought him into direct conflict with Stephen Douglas, the most powerful Democrat in the state and a national figure with presidential ambitions. Douglas was charismatic, confident, and a master debater. He defended the Kansas-Nebraska Act as the embodiment of popular sovereignty, the right of settlers to decide for themselves. To him, Lincoln's moral argument was idealistic and dangerous, a path toward disunion. Their collision was inevitable, and when it came, it electrified the nation. The year was 1858. Lincoln, now the Republican candidate for the U.S. Senate, challenged Douglas to a series of public debates. Over the course of 3 months, the two men faced off in 7 Illinois towns, drawing enormous crowds. Newspapers across the country reprinted their exchanges, turning local gatherings into national theater. The Lincoln-Douglas debates became one of the defining moments in American political history. Lincoln's performance astonished even his allies. Tall and lean, his voice rising with conviction, he spoke to the conscience of ordinary citizens. He avoided grand gestures and focused instead on logic, morality, and the nation's founding documents. Douglas was polished and combative. Lincoln was sincere and persuasive. The difference between them was stark. One argued from political calculation, the other from moral principle. In one of his most famous arguments, Lincoln declared, "A house divided against itself cannot stand." He warned that the nation could not endure half slave and half free. It would eventually become one or the other. The line struck a nerve. To his supporters, it was a bold declaration of truth. To his opponents, it was reckless, an invitation to civil strife. Yet the phrase captured perfectly the tension of the era, and it echoed across the country. Although Lincoln ultimately lost the Senate race to Douglas, the debates transformed him from an Illinois lawyer into a national figure. Newspapers from New York to Boston printed his speeches, praising his moral clarity and the quiet strength of his reasoning. Even those who disagreed with him could not ignore the depth of his intellect and integrity. The debates gave the country a glimpse of something it had long been missing, a politician who could rise above self-interest and speak for the nation's higher ideals. The experience also revealed the depth of Lincoln's empathy and restraint. He never demonized Douglas personally, even when the debates grew heated. He believed in persuasion, not humiliation. His ability to separate disagreement from hatred would later prove essential when the divisions he warned about erupted into war. But fame came with a price. The more Lincoln spoke against slavery's expansion, the more enemies he gained. Southern newspapers denounced him as a dangerous radical, while some in the North accused him of cowardice for not calling for outright abolition. Lincoln occupied the narrow, treacherous middle ground, a place of principle between two extremes. Yet it was that balance, that capacity to understand both sides without surrendering his convictions, that made him uniquely suited for the age to come. In private, Lincoln felt the weight of his rising prominence. He often confessed to friends that he never sought greatness, only to do what was right. He was acutely aware of his limitations, and the more he was praised, the more cautious he became. Fame, to him, was not triumph but burden. Still he pressed on, guided by a sense of destiny he could neither explain nor escape. By the end of the 1850s, America stood on the brink of rupture. The debates over slavery had grown too fierce, the compromises too fragile, yet amid the noise, one voice began to rise, measured, compassionate, and resolute. Abraham Lincoln had not yet reached the presidency, but he had found something even more enduring, his purpose. He was no longer merely the honest Abe of New Salem or the small-town lawyer of Springfield. He had become something far greater, a symbol of conscience in a nation at war with itself, a man whose words carried the power to define the meaning of freedom. The stage was set, and the next chapter of his life would thrust him into the center of the greatest moral and political crisis in American history. By 1860, Abraham Lincoln stood at the edge of destiny. What had begun as the journey of a humble frontier lawyer had become something far greater, the ascent of a man whose voice now echoed across a nation divided against itself. The United States was fracturing under the weight of slavery, and in that turbulent atmosphere, Lincoln's rise to the presidency was as unlikely as it was inevitable. The decade leading up to the election had been one of chaos. The Compromise of 1850, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and the Dred Scott decision had each deepened the chasm between North and South. Violence had erupted in Kansas, where pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers battled for control. In Congress, arguments turned into brawls, and newspapers openly speculated that the Union might not survive. Amid this turmoil, Lincoln's steady moral reasoning stood out like a beacon. He was not the loudest voice, but perhaps the clearest, a man who appealed to the conscience rather than to fear. After the Lincoln-Douglas debates, his reputation spread beyond Illinois. He was invited to speak across the North, each appearance drawing larger crowds. His most important moment came in February 1860 at Cooper Union in New York City. There, before an audience of scholars, politicians, and journalists, Lincoln delivered one of the most important speeches of his life. Calm, deliberate, and precise, he traced the history of America's founding fathers, proving that they had intended slavery to fade, not flourish. His message was not fiery but reasoned, a call to preserve the moral integrity of the Republic. The speech was a triumph. Newspapers across the country praised his intellect and moderation. No man ever before made such an impression on his first appeal to a New York audience, one reporter wrote. Overnight, Lincoln transformed from a regional figure into a national contender. Still, few believed he could actually become president. The Republican Party was new, fractured, and dominated by powerful Eastern politicians with deeper pockets and grander pedigrees. Lincoln, by contrast, was a self-made man from the frontier, humble, awkward, with no aristocratic polish. Yet those very qualities worked in his favor. To ordinary Americans, he represented authenticity and honesty at a time when politics seemed driven by cynicism and corruption. The Republican National Convention in Chicago that May would decide his fate. Delegates gathered in a massive wooden building nicknamed the Wigwam, a roaring hall filled with banners, marching bands, and the fever of ambition. Lincoln's team, led by skilled Illinois organizers, executed a brilliant political strategy. They presented him as the compromise candidate, moderate enough to unite the party, yet firm enough to oppose slavery's expansion. His rivals, including William H. Seward of New York, were seen as too radical or too tied to political elites. Lincoln himself stayed home in Springfield, anxiously waiting for news as telegrams arrived by the hour. On the third ballot, his support surged. When the final vote was tallied, the crowd erupted. Against all expectations, Abraham Lincoln had secured the Republican nomination for President of the United States. The victory shocked the nation. Many Northerners celebrated the rise of a man who embodied the ideals of hard work and honesty. Southerners, however, saw in his nomination a dire threat. To them, Lincoln was a symbol of abolition and federal interference, even though he had repeatedly stated he would not abolish slavery where it already existed. Fear and resentment spread through the southern states long before the election was even held. The campaign of 1860 was one of the most volatile in American history. The Democratic Party had splintered into northern and southern factions, splitting its vote between Stephen Douglas and John C. Breckinridge. Another candidate, John Bell, ran on a platform of preserving the Union at all costs. In the midst of this chaos, Lincoln's message of moderation and moral clarity stood apart. He rarely campaigned in person, relying instead on his words, printed and reprinted in newspapers across the country, to speak for him. When the results came in on November 6, 1860, Lincoln had won the presidency without carrying a single southern state. His support came entirely from the North and West, a clear sign that the nation was no longer united. Celebrations erupted across northern cities, but in the South, the reaction was fury and fear. Within weeks, South Carolina voted to secede from the Union, followed quickly by Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. The months that followed were tense and uncertain. As president-elect, Lincoln could do little but watch as the country began to unravel. Newspapers speculated daily about war. Federal forts in the South were seized by secessionists. In Springfield, Lincoln received delegations pleading for compromise, but he remained resolute. The Union, he insisted, must be preserved. "We are not enemies," he said, "but friends we must not be enemies." Yet he knew that friendship alone would not hold a fractured nation together. On the morning of February 11, 1861, Lincoln boarded a train that would take him from Springfield to Washington, D.C. The farewell he gave that day was simple, heartfelt, and filled with foreboding. "To this place and the kindness of these people," he said, "I owe everything. Here I have lived a quarter of a century and have passed from a young to an old man. Here my children have been born, and one is buried. I now leave, not knowing when or whether ever I may return." As his train departed, rain fell on the platform. The faces of his friends blurred in the grey light, men and women who had known him as neighbour, lawyer and friend, now watching him leave as the leader of a nation on the brink of war. His election had brought both hope and dread, unity and division. And as the landscape of Illinois faded from view, Abraham Lincoln began the most perilous journey of his life, toward a presidency that would test not only his strength, but the very soul of America. When Abraham Lincoln took the oath of office on March 4, 1861, he faced a nation already breaking apart. 11 southern states had declared their secession, and the air in Washington was thick with fear and uncertainty. Armed militias gathered in the streets, rumors of assassination filled the capital, and government offices buzzed with talk of disunion. The man who arrived at the White House was not the towering legend history would later remember, but a weary, anxious leader stepping into the darkest hour of the American experiment. Lincoln's inaugural address was a plea for reason. Standing beneath a cloudy sky, he spoke directly to the South with words of reconciliation rather than retribution. "We are not enemies, but friends," he said. "We must not be enemies." His tone was calm, deliberate, almost fatherly, an appeal to conscience rather than to force. Yet even as his words reached the crowd, Confederate guns were being loaded, and the path to war was already set. The crisis came swiftly. On April 12, 1861, Confederate forces fired on Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor. The cannon fire echoed across the nation, the first shots of the Civil War. Within days, Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteers to defend the Union, a move that solidified the North's resolve, but also drove the remaining slave states of the Upper South, including Virginia, into secession. The Union was now at war with itself. Lincoln had no experience commanding armies, and the scale of the conflict was beyond anything the nation had ever faced. He worked tirelessly, often late into the night, reading military reports by lamplight and writing letters to his generals. The strain began to show almost immediately. Observers noted how quickly he aged, his face growing lined, his eyes sunken, his frame thinner by the month. Yet behind that gaunt exterior was a mind that refused to yield. The early months of the war were a nightmare of confusion and failure. The Union Army suffered defeat after defeat, most notably at Bull Run, where inexperienced Northern troops fled in chaos. Newspapers savaged Lincoln, calling him weak, indecisive, and unfit for command. Political rivals mocked his background and his manner of speech. Even members of his own cabinet doubted him, each convinced they could manage the crisis better. Lincoln listened, endured, and learned. Every setback became a lesson in leadership. He also faced a moral dilemma, unlike any president before him: how to save the Union without destroying the principles it stood for. At first, his goal was preservation, not revolution. He insisted the war was being fought to restore the Union, not to abolish slavery. "If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it," he wrote in 1862. "If I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it." But beneath those words was a deepening conviction that the two causes, union and freedom, were bound together. Lincoln's greatest strength during these early years was his patience. He allowed his ideas to evolve, guided not by pride but by experience. He dismissed generals who failed him and replaced them with others, often to public outrage. When he found Ulysses S. Grant, a man of quiet determination and relentless will, he recognized in him a reflection of his own endurance. "I can't spare this man," Lincoln said. "He fights." The personal toll, however, was immense. The White House became both his sanctuary and his prison. The corridors echoed with the sound of telegrams arriving from the front, lists of the dead, reports of shattered armies, pleas from generals for reinforcements. Lincoln read them all. He visited soldiers in hospitals, shook hands with grieving families, and spent long nights alone, wrestling with decisions that would cost thousands of lives. Those close to him spoke of his melancholy deepening, though he rarely let despair show in public. To cope, Lincoln turned to humor and storytelling, tools that helped him survive the pressure. He would tell anecdotes during cabinet meetings, not to trivialize the crisis, but to relieve the unbearable tension that filled the room. His humor, often gentle and self-deprecating, was a shield against despair. Yet when the laughter faded, the weight of leadership returned with crushing force. Criticism pursued him relentlessly. Abolitionists accused him of cowardice for not ending slavery outright. Democrats called him a tyrant for suspending habeas corpus and arresting those who opposed the war. Southern leaders portrayed him as a despot bent on destroying their way of life. Through it all, Lincoln stood firm in his belief that the Union must survive, not for power, but for principle. He saw the United States as the last best hope of democracy, and he would not let it perish on his watch. In his private letters, glimpses of the man beneath the title emerge, a leader torn between determination and doubt. "I am not bound to win," he wrote, "but I am bound to be true. I am not bound to succeed, but I am bound to live by the light that I have." These were not the words of a man certain of his greatness, but of one struggling to do what was right amid unbearable uncertainty. By 1863, Lincoln had grown into his role. The timid lawyer from Illinois had become a commander-in-chief capable of making ruthless, necessary decisions. He had learned to balance compassion with firmness, to temper idealism with realism. The presidency had carved him, tested him, and in that crucible he emerged transformed, no longer merely the guardian of a divided nation, but the moral leader of its rebirth. Yet the war was far from over. The Union was still bleeding, the Confederacy still defiant. The public, exhausted by loss, demanded an end that seemed forever out of reach. But Lincoln's resolve had hardened. He understood now that victory alone was not enough, that the war must also redeem the nation as soul. And as the fires of battle raged across the land, he prepared to take the most consequential step of his life, to strike at the very heart of slavery itself. By 1862, Abraham Lincoln found himself at a crossroads unlike any other in American history. The Civil War had dragged on far longer than anyone imagined. Thousands were dead, the Union Army had failed to achieve decisive victories, and public morale was sinking fast. In the White House, Lincoln carried the crushing weight of both political chaos and moral urgency. The war that began to preserve the Union was slowly transforming into something larger, a battle over the very meaning of freedom itself. From the beginning, Lincoln's views on slavery had been careful, deliberate, and deeply conflicted. He despised the institution on moral grounds, yet as president he was bound by the Constitution and by the fragile loyalties of border states that still permitted slavery but had not joined the Confederacy. To act too boldly risked driving them into secession. To act too timidly risked losing the soul of the Union. Between those extremes, Lincoln walked a narrow and lonely path. Privately, he wrestled with questions that cut to the core of his being. Could a democracy founded on liberty survive if it tolerated bondage? Could he, as a leader, justify sending men to die for a union that did not guarantee freedom to all? These were not abstract questions to him, they were spiritual ones. He told a visitor, "If slavery is not wrong, nothing is wrong." But knowing that truth and acting upon it were two very different things. The pressures mounted from all sides. Radical abolitionists demanded immediate emancipation, while conservative politicians warned that such a move would destroy what little unity remained in the North. Lincoln listened to them all, but he also watched the war itself begin to reshape the question. As Union armies advanced into Confederate territory, enslaved people began fleeing to Union lines by the thousands, seeking freedom. Generals in the field called them contraband of war, a cold, legal term that masked a human revolution. The reality was unavoidable. The war had made slavery untenable. Lincoln's mind began to shift. The war, he realized, could not be won without redefining its purpose. "We must free the slaves," he told his cabinet, "or be ourselves subdued." The moment demanded not just strategy, but moral courage, the kind born of struggle and doubt, not blind certainty. That summer, in the heat of 1862, Lincoln made his decision. He would issue a proclamation freeing the slaves in all states still in rebellion. But first, he waited. The Union had suffered a string of defeats, and he knew that such a momentous decree could not follow weakness. He needed a victory to give it strength and legitimacy. When General George McClellan finally repelled Confederate forces at the Battle of Antietam in September, Lincoln seized the moment. On September 22, 1862, he announced his preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. It declared that if the rebellious states did not return to the Union by January 1, 1863, their slaves would be, thenceforward, and forever free. The reaction was seismic. Abolitionists rejoiced, seeing it as the beginning of a new moral dawn. Many Northern Democrats condemned it as reckless. Border state politicians were outraged. The South viewed it as proof that Lincoln intended to destroy their entire social order. Lincoln endured the backlash with calm resolve. In private, he admitted to the immense weight of what he had done. "I have never in my life felt more certain that I was doing right," he said. "But I have never felt more anxious about the consequences." He knew the proclamation was imperfect. It freed no slaves in loyal border states and applied only to areas under Confederate control. But it transformed the war's purpose. No longer was the fight merely for the Union, it was for human liberty. When January 1, 1863 arrived, the final Emancipation Proclamation was ready. That morning, Lincoln's hand trembled as he prepared to sign it. He paused, reflecting on the moment. His right hand was numb from shaking so many hands at a New Year's reception earlier that day. He feared that if his signature appeared weak or shaky, people might say he had wavered. Gathering his strength, he signed firmly. Then he looked up and said quietly, "I never in my life felt more certain that I was doing right than I do in signing this paper." The document itself was legal, precise and restrained, the language of policy, not poetry. Yet its implications were revolutionary. It declared freedom for over 3 million enslaved men, women and children, and it gave the Union cause a moral power it had never possessed. From that moment, every step of a Union soldier carried the weight of liberation. The war for the Union had become a war for freedom. The proclamation did not end slavery. That would come later with the 13th Amendment, but it changed the moral landscape of the nation and the world. It turned the tide of diplomacy, preventing Britain and France from recognizing the Confederacy. It also allowed black men to enlist in the Union Army, and more than 180,000 would do so by war's end, fighting not just for a country that had once enslaved them, but for the promise of a better future. Still, Lincoln knew his decision came at a great personal and political cost. His critics multiplied. Some newspapers called him King Abraham. His own re-election prospects seemed doomed. Yet in his quiet moments, he found solace in the conviction that he had chosen the right path. "The promise being made," he wrote, "must be kept." Behind the myth of the great emancipator was not a man born certain of his place in history, but one who struggled every step toward it, who doubted, questioned, and suffered for the truth he came to embrace. His courage was not the courage of confidence, but of conscience. And through that conscience, he reshaped the moral destiny of a nation. In freeing others, Abraham Lincoln had also freed himself from hesitation, from compromise, from the limits of the world he had inherited. The Union still burned in war, but its purpose now burned brighter than ever. Freedom had become its cause, and Lincoln its reluctant, resolute champion. By 1864, Abraham Lincoln had become a man transformed, not by triumph but by suffering. The war that he had once hoped would end swiftly had dragged on into its 4th bloody year. The Union was finally gaining ground, but at a staggering cost. Fields from Pennsylvania to Georgia were carpeted with the dead. Every day brought new lists of casualties, and each name was a wound to the nation's soul. The White House, once a place of laughter and receptions, had grown somber and quiet. Lincoln walked its halls like a ghost, weary, reflective, and aged far beyond his 55 years. The war had taken everything from him. He had watched young men die by the tens of thousands, had endured slander from newspapers, mutiny from generals, and despair from his own cabinet. His beloved son Willie had died in 1862, a loss that left him broken in ways even the presidency could not conceal. Mary, his wife, spiraled into grief and bouts of instability. Yet through the pain, Lincoln's compassion deepened. His melancholy gave him not bitterness but empathy. "I feel like the man who was hit on the head by a dead rabbit," he once joked grimly. "It stunned me, but it didn't kill me." Humor still was his way of surviving the unbearable. As the war turned in the Union's favor, so too did the public's view of him. The victories of 1863, Gettysburg and Vicksburg, marked the beginning of the Confederacy's collapse. Lincoln seized the moment to redefine America's purpose once more. Standing on the battlefield at Gettysburg, before rows of freshly dug graves, he spoke just 272 words, a speech so brief that the photographers missed it. Yet in those few lines, he gave meaning to all the suffering. The war, he said, was not just about preserving the Union, but about giving a new birth of freedom to the nation. It was the speech of a man who saw beyond politics, who had come to view the tragedy as a test of humanity itself. But the political battles were not over. As the 1864 election approached, even Lincoln's allies doubted he could win. The war was unpopular, and peace Democrats accused him of tyranny. He believed he would lose. "I am going to be beaten," he told his aides, "unless some great change takes place." Then in September, General William Tecumseh Sherman captured Atlanta. The victory electrified the North. Within weeks, the tide of public opinion turned, and Lincoln was re-elected in a landslide. On the night of his re-election, he sat quietly in his office, reflecting not on victory, but on responsibility. He told those gathered, "It has long been a grave question whether any government not too strong for the liberties of its people can be strong enough to maintain its own existence in great emergencies." He paused, his voice low. Now we know the answer. As 1865 dawned, the Confederacy was crumbling. Richmond, the Confederate capital, fell in early April. Lincoln insisted on visiting the city himself. As he walked through its burned streets, newly freed slaves followed him, kneeling in gratitude. Lincoln, overwhelmed, raised his hand and said softly, "Don't kneel to me. That is not right. You must kneel only to God and thank Him for your freedom." It was a moment that revealed his essence: humble, compassionate, human. In those final weeks, his thoughts turned toward peace. He dreamed not of punishment, but of reconciliation. "Let us have malice toward none, charity for all," he urged in his second inaugural address, perhaps the most profound speech ever given by an American president. He spoke not as a conqueror, but as a healer, urging forgiveness even as the wounds of war still bled. He envisioned a nation rebuilt on mercy and understanding, where both North and South could once again call themselves one people. But history, relentless as ever, had other plans. On April 14, 1865, Good Friday, Lincoln attended a play at Ford's Theater with Mary. The war was over, the Union preserved, and the promise of peace felt within reach. For the first time in years, he seemed light-hearted. He laughed freely, spoke tenderly to his wife, and told friends that he felt unusually happy. As the play unfolded, a well-known actor and Confederate sympathizer named John Wilkes Booth slipped into the presidential box, drew a small pistol, and fired a single shot into the back of Lincoln's head. The sound echoed through the theater, a sound that seemed to still the heart of a nation. Lincoln was carried across the street to a boarding house, where he lay unconscious through the night. Soldiers and doctors crowded the room as dawn approached. When the clock struck 7:22 a.m. on April 15, 1865, Abraham Lincoln breathed his last. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, standing at his bedside, broke the silence. Now he belongs to the ages. The news spread across the country like a storm. Church bells tolled, cities fell into mourning, and millions wept as if they had lost a father. Trains carried his body back to Springfield, where thousands lined the tracks in silent tribute. Flowers were laid along the rails. Children saluted as the great black car passed. It was a journey not just of farewell, but of transformation, from man to legend, from leader to symbol. In death, Lincoln became what he had never sought in life, a martyr for liberty, a moral giant in the story of a nation still learning to live up to its own ideals. Yet the truth of his greatness lay not in perfection, but in humanity. He had doubts, fears, and flaws. He made mistakes and learned from them. He suffered deeply but never hardened. His strength came not from certainty, but from compassion, from his ability to see himself in others, even in his enemies. The war ended. The Union endured. Slavery was abolished. But the work he began, the pursuit of a just and united America, remained unfinished, passed on to those who came after. Lincoln's life reminds us that true leadership is not about power or glory. It is about empathy, humility, and the quiet courage to do what is right, even when the world stands against you. He entered history as the great emancipator, but perhaps his greatest legacy is something simpler. He showed a divided nation how to find its conscience again. And though that single bullet silenced his voice, the echo of his words, of a government of the people, by the people, for the people, still shapes the heartbeat of America.